Welcome to W Report. This is an analytical transformation of an interview. Gilbert Doctorow is a political analyst and commentator focused on Russia, Europe, and U.S.-Russia relations. What exactly is in the recent United States-European Union trade deal struck by von der Leyen and Trump? Why do many see it as capitulation and subordination? And how could it reshape United States-European Union relations while straining the European Union's internal cohesion?
The agreement that was reached in Scotland has two important sides to it. One is what everybody is talking about, the tariffs. And the tariffs are now set at generally 15%, down from a tentative 25% before an agreement was reached. But that doesn't cover all products and services. Airplanes or airplane parts, for example, are not included in this. They're at a much lower tariff rate. There are other products which will be negotiated still. For example, wines and liquor, which are of great interest to one of the leading countries in the EU, that is France, and that probably will be negotiated at a different level, lower level, in the wishes of the French. But looking at the tariffs, that is severe. It is compared to where we were at the start of the year. It is less than the dramatic and ruinous tariffs that Trump had spoken about before he would negotiate a deal. And will this bring European manufacturing across the ocean to the United States at the expense of jobs in Europe? It's not quite clear. There is very little discussion of what Europe actually sells to the States and how vulnerable it is to loss of market share due to price increases. That's something we can perhaps get into. But what I have in mind is that mass products that are bought and used by the vast majority of the population, they are not typically European products. They are Chinese products. European products include a lot of luxury goods, and luxury goods are being sold to wealthy people for whom a 15% tariff won't make a big difference. So the real impact on European sales in the States from this agreement in Scotland, it still has to be refined. One cannot make definitive statements yet because it's not complete. There are these negotiations at the margins. But what was most outstanding, and of course what impressed observers of all political stripes, by the way, not just observers who are anti-American or pro-American. No. All observers came to one conclusion. It was, as you say, a capitulation. To put it in other terms, it was an enormous humiliation for Europe. Von der Leyen went to Scotland, cap in hand, as more or less a beggar, without any, not negotiating from strength, as they like to say these days. On the contrary, she was negotiating from weakness and from the fear that the failure to reach an agreement would end in a tariff war that could cost Europe 5 million jobs. So she was under enormous pressure to ingratiate herself with a man whom she knows despises her. Trump has never made that a secret. And she came away with something that isn't too terrible. And that's the consensus, again, of observers here in Europe. It's not too terrible, but it's bad, and it's particularly bad for the way it was reached because it demonstrated that there is no leverage from the European side. But that is one side of the story. The other side of the discussion was the commitment by Europe to purchase $650 billion in American hydrocarbons, that is liquefied natural gas and petroleum, over the next 3 years. That is potentially a far bigger impact on Europe than this whole tariff discussion, because it locks in the non-competitive situation of European wares on world markets. The single biggest factor in the deindustrialization of Germany that has gone on for the last 3 years at least, when the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed, when Europe swore off to buying more Russian pipeline gas and cheap oil. That was a decisive factor, making the German economy uncompetitive. It was a decisive factor in whole sectors of industry shutting down completely. Those sectors that were highly dependent on cheap energy, like glass manufacturing, for example, and fertilizers, of course. These were hit enormously, and the fertilizers being hit, of course, has passed along to consumers in higher prices for all fresh produce, which is produced with less efficiency, with lower yields when the fertilizers are used more sparingly because they're so expensive. So this aspect is not in the featured news when it deserves to be. As I said, it locks in the uncompetitive status of European products on world markets. Now, can that figure be reached? That is another question. Will they actually reach it? Will they actually achieve that over the 3-year period? These are quite big question marks. The United States now exports $80 billion a year of hydrocarbons to Europe. To go from there to 250 or $215 billion a year is a big stretch, particularly since it's not obvious that America has the production capacity to fill orders should they come in. So that is all debatable. But if it were to be exercised, if in some way the United States could achieve these exports and Europe could absorb them, that will be a big dent in the European economies. And Europeans, the middle-of-the-road supporters of Atlanticism, had been searching hard to explain why they were so disadvantaged in the negotiations with Trump, how he was able to vanquish and have von der Leyen kneeling before him and kissing the ring. This is something that they're debating. The Belgian leading French-speaking newspaper, Le Soir, blamed the problem on Europe's overdependence on exports to drive economic growth. But that is not a convincing argument to anyone who is aware of global trade, since that is precisely the formula that China has used and continues to use so successfully to achieve its enormous growth, presently 5% per annum, whereas in the first quarter of 25, the Europeans were displaying great pleasure to have 0.1% GDP growth.
Tariffs are a smokescreen. The real hit is European Union commitments to buy United States oil and gas worth $650 billion over 3 years, locking in high energy costs and gutting industry. But where is the deal text, ratification, and actual United States capacity? Otherwise, this is a slogan. Gilbert, the European Union's dilemma is not trade, but over-reliance on the United States to win Washington's favor. The European Union cuts ties with Russia, China, Iran, and others, isolating itself and deepening dependence. Will this single alignment strengthen ties or weaken them by giving Washington too much leverage?
Strengthen means, for both parties, of course not. Strengthen the American leverage over Europe, definitely. The question is, why did Europe submit to this? Did it have to? What was the overriding consideration? Well, I think there is a certain understanding among many observers that the driving force was defense. And they hope that by staying close to Trump, by submitting to his will, they could maintain an ongoing conversation with him and persuade him to do what they want most of all, which is to continue to support Ukraine in its war on Russia, because they have made that, arbitrarily, they have made that an existential threat to themselves for the sake of the leadership staying in power. That is to say, they're singing and dancing and moving from the story of the last 3 years that Russia has to be defeated to the story of the present, which is we have to stay united. We need the present leadership in power because this is the only way that we can rearm Europe and prepare for a war with Russia that may take place as early as 2029. That is the current story that the present leadership in 25 out of 27 countries of the EU is putting forward to the press, to the public at large, as their re-election bid and as their bid for support. This is based on the same delusion that we've seen in their understanding of the Russia-Ukraine war from the beginning. The delusion here is that they can persuade Mr. Trump of anything. They can't. And they're listening to what he says, which is a terrible mistake. Mr. Trump has nothing but contempt for the press. He has nothing but contempt for most of the European leadership. He knows that they are weak, that they are cowardly, that they are conformist, and that they will be bullied. And that is essentially what he is. He is a bully. He's a bully who is successful at this trick. And he is telling them one thing and doing something else. What he's doing is stopping supplies to Ukraine. What he's doing, this is something we can get into, is probably aiding and abetting the eviction of Zelensky from office and his replacement by somebody who is capable of negotiating a peace treaty with the Russians. So they are going to be bitterly disappointed. They've made a bet. They have allowed themselves to be humiliated for the sake of continuing a war with American help, which will not happen.
Could the deal backfire with Trump saying we got the money back and walking away? How willing is he to stay engaged in Europe despite harsher Russia rhetoric? And did the European Union secure any real guarantees with this deal?
Well, he keeps everybody guessing, including those who have bet the house on the successful relationship with Trump by the handshake agreement this past weekend in Scotland. He keeps them all guessing. And even yesterday, there was a expression of horror that was picked up by major media here in Western Europe that Trump was about to do a deal, cut a deal with Vladimir Putin that would be vastly destructive of all the ambitions of the EU. I don't think he's going to cut such a deal. I don't think that he has anything to offer the Russians that could persuade them to yield in any way on their conduct of the war when the victory on the ground is so close to being achieved. So that is also nonsense. But they are uncertain. The Europeans here are hoping that they have him online and can persuade him by pointing to these terrible acts of bombing and that the Russians are committing now in Kyiv and elsewhere. But they can persuade him using Melanie, perhaps, all kinds of levers that they believe, want to believe, can get Trump to change his mind in the hope that he is not a serious man, that he does not have long-term vision, and that he can be changed from one day to the next by somebody whispering in his ear. That is all false, completely false. Nonetheless, it persists as a widespread notion of who Mr. Trump is here in Western Europe. And then you have the really special relationship with Keir Starmer, which would seem to demonstrate the validity of such assumptions about Trump. But also, Starmer went to Scotland. Trump didn't come down to London. He was also a supplicant. And the relationship there with the British, they have the most favored tariff deal out of all countries with the United States at present with a 10% tariff. And they're gloating over that. But they still have 50% tariffs on steel, which were a very important export product to the United States. And so the British have been given the hope that they have a favored position with the United States as against Europe. But it can change at any moment. And I think that, again, looking at politics, who stands where? Well, Mr. Starmer is the head of the Labour Party, which is to the left, shall we say, of Mr. Trump's politics. I don't think he enjoys real respect. Trump has it his way, and he gets a meeting with the king. That's fine. He likes pomp and circumstance, but I don't think that he is genuinely influenced in making policy on these superficial acts one way or another with this or that state leader. He has his own determination to self-impose sanctions on the United States by way of tariffs for the sake of reindustrializing the United States, and I don't think it's a vain proposal.
European Union leaders increasingly prioritize foreign policy over domestic needs. The United States still sacrifices economy and social issues to court Washington and prolong the war in Ukraine. How long can this last? And is there enough political stability to pass such a deal after cutting off Russian energy and the Nord Stream sabotage?
Well, one thing I was to bring up is what we mean when we say Europeans and who makes European policy. I've been rereading my materials going back to 2015 in preparation for the volume 3 of my memoirs, and I was very focused on Germany in 2015. Spoke about it at several conferences and wrote about it in what I consider to be a very important policy analysis that was published in comparative politics of McGimo, the Russian university that prepares diplomats. What I was saying then is the European policy is made in Berlin. And this is a well-kept secret. In 2015, just as in 2025, all the top posts in the European institutions are German designated. They were appointed by Germans. And they have appointed, in the present case, von der Leyen has appointed people like Kallas, people from Lithuania, people from Poland, who are under her thumb. They are representing small countries, insignificant weight compared to the 450 million population of the EU. They are often people with intellectual lightweights, like Kallas, who can be dominated by a strong and willful personality like von der Leyen. That is to say, the commissioner, the head of the president of the commission, the head of the parliament, the president of the parliament. Yes, she's Italian, but she's appointed by the majority, which is dominated by the European People's Party, which is dominated by the Christian Democrats. But the strings all go back to Berlin, just as they did in 2015 when Juncker was there. Yes, of course, he was Luxembourger, but he was a weak man who was nominated and supported by Merkel, because she knew she could control him because there were scandals around. Just as Tusk at that time, he was made the president of the European Council. Tusk, who could hardly speak English, but spoke very good German, by the way, she appointed him. And nobody bothered to think about what the German connection was there. He was under her thumb. So that was how it was in 2015. That's how it is today. And just as the only thing that's changed is that Germans today have come out from behind the apron strings of EU institutions and are saying openly that they want to become, for example, the main military force in Europe. So who is Europe? Europe is Germany. Mr. Merz is the decisive voice on whether the tariffs agreed by von der Leyen will go through, and many other policy decisions. Your question about why foreign policy? That's what you do when you're losing and you can't control domestic policy. You're speaking about very unpopular leaders. Keir Starmer has lost control of the Labour Party on domestic issues. He had a very severe setback when his reforms on support of the needy, of the wealth, of the benefits reforms were rejected by his own party, and watered down to almost nil, where they hope to save a lot of money in the budget. Starmer on domestic issues is very weak. Therefore, he can only hope to shine on international issues where nobody can say much. The same is true of Macron. His domestic standing is negligible. He has very little popular support. And so he goes trotting around the globe, speaking like Mr. France and getting the press to listen to him. This is normal politics of the losing side.
European Union elites seek to bind the United States to the Ukraine project and stay in power by prolonging the war, betting on Russia's defeat and Ukraine's NATO entry, both unlikely. With Zelensky weakening and the narrative shifting, what happens to him in Ukraine, and how would Europe absorb a Ukrainian defeat?
It's permitted not just to YouTube channels, it's permitted to the Financial Times. They use that word in a headline of an article dealing with the new law stripping the anti-corruption agencies of their independence. He has damaged goods now, and he's damaged goods in the Anglo-Saxon press in particular, on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, the question that I've had is who was behind the enabling of the demonstrations that took place, the mass demonstrations that took place in Kyiv and in other major cities in Ukraine over the course of several days, in the past week, against the law, which ultimately ended in the relocation of the new law and restoration of what is said to be the independence of these agencies. The speculation now again, I will share with your audience what the Russians are saying about this. They're saying that we can expect in the immediate future very scandalous trials. Already yesterday, there's an indication that a newly installed prime minister was about to be charged with corrupt practices for having used, together with Yermak, the head of the presidential administration, Ukrainian airplanes, which are only to be used for state purposes. She, as the prime minister, has the right to use it. Yermak didn't. And it was pretty obvious that she was doing, the man who was behind her, who protects her, Mr. Yermak, she was doing this trip with him for his benefit, not for her own. So that's the first shoe to fall. There are going to be some very big accusations made in the next few weeks against people in the close entourage of Zelensky and probably of Zelensky himself. We are now in the last stages of Zelensky's time in office. The question is, who is pushing this most? Is it Britain with the MI6, who helped arrange that the Ukrainian police and military would not attack the demonstrators? Or was it the CIA? There are two. These are now, you could say in the past they were one and the same, but not anymore, because the United States and Britain have parted ways on the Ukraine war. For the Brits to have done this, it would be to replace Zelensky probably with Zaluzhny. Let's remember, for the last year and a half, Zaluzhny, who was the head of the armed forces of Ukraine for several years, and who was viewed by Americans in particular as being a good candidate to replace Zelensky. He was moved out of Kyiv and sent off into exile to London, precisely so that to avoid that eventuality, that he would be on the inside, being able to muster support if the West nodded to him as the one to succeed Zelensky. Well, he's been biding his time in London. He's been learning English because he hardly could say 2 words when he arrived there, and he got there because he had said at the time what was true, how badly the Ukrainians were losing the war, and that was unacceptable to Zelensky. Now, that is one possibility. Another candidate the one I call out on the American side is a very different story. I think Zelensky would be put in if the intent was to continue the war and to have somebody who has more credibility with American and West European suppliers of arms to Ukraine, because he is a genuine military person, and his orders would not be for PR stunts like Zelensky's were, but having some genuine military foundation. Now, I'm saying that the Americans probably have a different game. If they were behind this, then it is probably to install somebody like Umerov, who is now the leader of negotiations in Istanbul. Umerov is a civilian. Umerov is a Crimean Tatar, a Muslim, by the way. Probably speaks some Arabic, some Turkish. It would be logical. He has been a leading personality in Ukrainian meetings with the Gulf states. More importantly for the United States, he's their boy. When he was in secondary school, he spent a year in the United States living with an American family. When he went back, finished his higher education, became a successful businessman in high-tech area, made a lot of money, he established fellowships for Ukrainians at Stanford University. I mean, why Stanford University? Why the United States? So he has an American connection, which is always looked upon. He doesn't have an American wife, but you can't get everything. So he would suit the Americans very nicely as a stand-in, and it is reasonable to assume that he could and would negotiate a peace treaty with the Russians, not on the ridiculous basis of Russian capitulation, but something close to Russian demands.
Doctorow puts tariffs in the background and sees the real risk in locking Europe into expensive U.S. energy worth hundreds of billions, which crushes competitiveness and leaves the EU begging. Brussels tries to buy Washington's presence for Ukraine and for its own survival, and runs into bullying and Trump's double game with a possible switch in Kyiv. The evidence is thin. No hard texts or dates, so judge by actual LNG contracts, the path of U.S. aid to Ukraine, and EU economic metrics. Thanks for watching. Support the channel if you find this format valuable. More deep dives are coming soon. Until then, think for yourself and draw your own conclusions.